Welcome to Parshat Nasso, which has many super interesting topics. I was looking back, and last year we talked about the priestly benediction that is found in this Parsha, which is super lovely. And then there are some like hard parts of this Parsha, like the Sota, the woman who is accused of forbidden relations. And Nazir falls somewhere in the middle, I think. I think that we're not sure is really the way to think about it. I'm going to share my screen. I shared a lot of text, which is like a big no-no in text, in source sheet etiquette, but we're not going to go through it all. I didn't know how to cut and paste it in a way that felt good to the text. So these are the psukim. These are the only psukim, the 17, maybe 18 psukim that sort of are a unit about Nazir. And the first thing I think to notice, right, is that ish o isha, so a man or a woman can do this, equal opportunity for both genders. Ki yafli lindor neder nazir, lahazir ladonai. So they explicitly utter a Nazirite's vow to set themselves apart for God, right? And so what does Nazir mean? Lahazir or Nazir means to set apart. And this is totally optional, right? It's not a punishment for something. It's not extra for some like elite sect of a community. This is just for a person, any of Bnei Israel who wants to do this. And when you take that vow to set yourself apart, it's not like however you view it. There are three very explicit things that a Nazir can't do. So the first is Mayayin the Sechar Yazir, right? That he'll stay away from wine and vinegar and any other products of grapes, right? Grapes or even raisins, yeveshim. He won't eat them and he won't drink them. So that's one. For all of the days, sorry, there we go. Kol yamei nizro ta'ar lo yavar al rosho. So he will not cut his hair. And there's something very interesting about the hair. I didn't have time to sort of tease that apart this year, but maybe that's next year. Something about the hair becomes very sacred, right? It's not just like the grapes where you don't drink them, but the razor not touching your head, right? The hair seems to be consecrated in some way to God, which is interesting. And then the last thing is that for the whole time, Kol Yimei Hanizro LaHashem, Al Nefesh Meit Lo Yavo, that he shouldn't be where there is a dead person, even an intimate family relation, right? So like Kohanim can't be near dead people, but they can bury their mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters. But for a Nazir, even if one of those close family relations dies, you cannot be near the dead body. And why is that? Because you are Kadosh LaHashem, but Ki Nezer Elohav al Rosho, because he has hair set apart for God upon his head. Like there's really something about the hair. I can't figure it out. But those are the three things, right? No wine, no cutting your hair, and no being near dead bodies. And the text here in the middle goes into what happens if by accident you're near a dead body, right? You can't by accident drink wine or by accident cut your hair. Although if you ask my children, they seem to always by accident cut their hair. You don't like walk into a pair of scissors. And so, but sometimes someone dies in front of you. What do? It pretty much avoids your Nazirut. And you have to bring a korban, and then you have to start again. You start from the beginning because somehow like it got messed up and you need to get back on track. And why was it void? Because the consecrated hair was defiled. It's just super fascinating, this hair obsession. Then what happens at the end? Normally, a period of a Nazirut was 30 days, but sometimes people took slightly longer periods on. It was certainly frowned upon to do it for too long. It's one of the reasons that you're not supposed to be a Nazir. You shouldn't take the vows of Nazirut today, because to finish them, as you see here, you offer a korban olah and a korban chatat, and we can't do that today. And so once you take the vow of Nazirut today, you're sort of stuck with it until you die. And again, it's frowned upon to do it for long periods. And this is all we have. There's no signaling words besides being kadosh, maybe, of whether this is good or this is bad. Should everyone strive to be a Nazir at some point in their life? Is this only for certain people, right? It's very hard to know how the Torah sort of feels about it as a thing. And the Nazir is is part of a larger section on Nidarim or Shavuot in general. So taking vows or taking oaths. And in the time of the Gemara, they talk a lot about those vows and oaths. And people are often they're vowing not to give benefit to other people. So like if I got mad at Elizabeth and I really wanted her to, I don't know, go take a walk with me. And I said, Elizabeth, if you don't take a walk with me, I vow you can never eat at my house again. Right? It's like it feels like very absurd, right? Like almost comical. Husbands and wives were constantly taking vows against each other, right? If this person doesn't do X, then I will withhold Y. And it seems like vows were often made sort of hastily in anger in that context. And this vow, of course, seems a little bit different because it feels like the Nazir is making like a promise. But the Gemara in Ta'anit frowns upon the Nazir. There in Ta'anit means fast. They're talking about people who take extra fast days on themselves. And the question is, right, we say that you can't add anything to the Torah, right? You should keep the laws, but you shouldn't add new laws. So it's okay to say, I won't eat shellfish because those are not considered kosher, but you couldn't say, well, I won't eat chicken as though it were shellfish, right? You could decide not to eat chicken, but you shouldn't vow it as like a law. You shouldn't add it as a law. And so the Shmuel says that whoever sits and fasts, kol hayoshev b'ta'anit, like an unscheduled fast, nikrat choteh, that someone who does that is considered as a sinner. And so Rabbi Elazar Hakapar says, well, hold on. What about the Nazirite, right? Right? With what soul did the Nazirite sin, right? He's quoting our pasuk where it says that he sinned, and he says, oh, ela shetzi'er atzmo min hayayin, because he added distress to his life when he decided to abstain from wine. Right. And so there seems to be something wrong with it. Right. And then they infer a kal vachomer. So saying if the Nazir who only abstains from wine is called a sinner, how much more so must be someone who abstains from food and all drinks as a faster would be considered a sinner. Right. And so this looks very down on the Nazir. To say that he is like this Choteh, right? But the faster is still sort of worse. However, then Rabbi Elazar says, sort of arguing the other side, he says, well, Nikra Kadosh. Okay, he's called a Choteh, but he's also called holy, right? Kadosh Yegadel Pera Sa'ar. That's in the Sa'ar Rosho, in the Psukim above. Umazeh Shalotzi Eratzmo, Elami Davar Echad, Nikra Kadosh, right? Someone who only took abstains from one thing is called Kadosh. The person who sits in his fast, he must be so much more sacred. So the sinner seems to be both worse and far better than the Nazir. The Nazir is sort of stuck in the middle on some level. But clearly, there's something about distressing oneself and taking on things that are not required that is sort of worrisome. To the Gemara, right? I was listening to a beautiful podcast from Pardes yesterday where they talked about how a neder could be an anchor. It's sort of when you are being flighty, an anchor is helpful, but when you are already sort of set in your path, an anchor actually holds you back from being flexible. Right. And so I think that latter way is sort of the way the Gemara is thinking about it, is if you take someone who already is not drinking a lot and you say, well, I'm not going to drink at all, you've anchored yourself into a set path that is not so good. I think the other way of thinking, maybe in a more modern lens about a Nazir, is what about someone who knows that drinking is hard for them, right? It leads them down a sort of addictive path. And so they need to say, I am a Nazir, I'm taking a 1 month break from alcohol because I need that anchor, right? I am like all over the place and I need to sort of be centered in a good, healthy lifestyle. So, I think that you could see the other side of this, but that's certainly, they're thinking of it as adding distress to someone. And the Rambam, who is a big fan of the golden mean, the middle way, he explicitly says, someone who says, Shama Adam Yamar Adam, Shelo ya'achal basar, v'lo yishta yayin, v'lo yisa isha, v'lo yeshev badira na'eh, v'lo yalbush malbush na'eh. Right? That someone who says they won't eat meat, they won't drink wine, they won't get married, they won't live in a nice house, right? Bayit na'eh or dira na'eh. They won't wear nice clothes. They'll just wear this like sort of rough material, b'kayotze bahen, like these sort of weird heathen priests. I'm not sure exactly what that is in reference to. Zo derech ra'ahi. This is a very bad path. V'asur lelech ba. Right? The Rambam is saying, listen, it's okay, right? We are a religion that does not say you should like shut yourself up like a monk or a nun in a convent. We're supposed to have meat and wine, and we're supposed to get married and have a family, right? And when you become a Nazir, you're denying yourself things. And the Rambam then here explicitly says, right, that lefichach tzivu chachamim shelo yimna adam atzmo ele midvarim sheme'aneh Torah bilvad. Right, when the Torah says not to do it, fine, don't do it, but you're not supposed to take extra things on yourself. The asur atzmo b'nedarim uv'shvaot al hadvarim hamutarim, and it's actually forbidden, according to the Rambam, to take a vow of abstinence on things permitted to you. And it certainly seems like the Nazir would fit in that category, right? The Rambam seems to really be down on Nazirut because it seems to be sort of against his cultural expectations of what Judaism is on some level. And it is adding or making more of the Torah. Like we don't have to be so machmir, the Rambam is saying. The Torah tells us what's allowed and not allowed. We don't have to add things. I think the Netivot Shalom explains it in a much nicer, sort of more spiritual way than the Rambam, right? He says, what is the purpose in the world? Tachlit habriya, of being human, the tachlit avodat Hashem, and of serving God. He sheyehudi yasok b'chol ha'inyanim hageshamim, hagashmiim v'yirim et hakol l'shem Hashem. Right? That there's this idea that we should, everything we do, all of our immersion in gashmiut, in like the physical world, should be in service of God. Because there's this Hasidic idea that our job is to somehow tether our world to the upper world, to God's world, to Shemayim. And that if we can take a glass of wine and elevate it to be sort of holy or spiritual, that's the path of the world, right? Is not to maybe go to a bar and have lots of drinks, but to drink at a tish or a fabrigan or at Kiddush time, right? And that you take something that could be used for a sort of gashmiut, of physical reason, and you elevate it to serve God. And he understands, right? Amnam haderech lifrosh lihitnaer mi'inyanei olam hazeh, hiderech yoter kala. It's easier to just say these things are dangerous, right? Sort of like that example of the person who feels like when he drinks wine or she drinks wine, they're out of control. It's easier just to never do it again. Aval hamadriga hayoter gavoa hi lahalot et kol inyanei olam hazeh laHashem yitbarach. Right? Because this is our purpose, right? So even though it's easier to just separate away, maybe the Netivot Shalom understands the Nazir's mindset, headspace. He says the purpose, right, is that we have to try to engage. We're not meant to take that easier path. We're meant to do this harder thing. So this is I think a pretty fair and strong case through, many generations of rabbis who say, look, the Nazir is like a very specific, unique case. You should only do this in some kind of extreme circumstance, because generally it's actually asur to do the kinds of thing that the Nazir does, to abstain from things that are allowed. However, the Nazir does have some advocates, right? The Ibn Ezra notes that the word Nazir is very much related to the word nezer, a crown. And so thinking about being consecrated, right, with a crown, sort of like, King Charles just was, right? There's some sort of consecration. And that the king who wears that crown is a person who is free from lust, from ta'avot, from things that we desire in this world. And that most people, right, he's quite harsh. Most people, ki kol b'nei adam avdei ta'avat ha'olam. We are all slaves to worldly lusts, right? It's so easy to want to spend your money on wine or spend your time at a bar or whatever the thing is, and to forget, right? The Ibn Ezra is saying, like, you're not going to elevate it. You're just going to become a slave to it. That's like a nice thought, but you can almost imagine, I mean, that would be the wrong direction in time, but you can almost imagine the Ibn Ezra saying, listen, Netivot Shalom, nice idea, but it's not going to happen. And so the Nazir is someone who can sort of free himself from lust. One of the shiurim I heard over Shavuot in Skokie was someone who was talking about the commandment of coveting, not to covet, right? That's the only commandment that asks for you to change your thinking, perhaps, instead of your actions, right? Don't murder is not don't think about murdering someone, right? Don't imagine how wonderful it would be. It's, chas v'shalom. But coveting, it's not don't take the thing. We've covered that. That's don't steal, right? And so not coveting seems to be like an intellectual exercise. And I feel like that's what the Ibn Ezra is saying too, is that although we don't drink wine, we don't shave our head, we don't interact with dead bodies, what the Nazir is really trying to do is to make it so that he doesn't even desire wine, right? It's like a totally different experience to be free from lust. I think that's a powerful thing to say. And Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch here, he talks about a different dimension of Nazirut. He says, right, the basic meaning of Nazir is to keep aloof, to keep separate, to be separated for God. So that just as a Nazir means a royal diadem, which marks the person whose head it surrounds as being set apart and inaccessible, so here a Nazir designates a regime of living and striving that raises the person who vows of his own free will to undertake it out of and about the midst of the people with whom he lives, and sets him to the task to be completely holy to God, to belong with the whole of his being and will exclusively to his God. He wishes to draw a circle around himself in which only God is to be present. Right, so here Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch is also picking up on that Nazir connection, but instead of making it like the person is free from lust, he's saying, well, if you think about a court with a king, the king is sort of set apart from everyone else. He's alone, he's aloof. And so too, that's what the Nazir wants. And in some ways it sounds beautiful, right? To draw a circle around oneself in which only God is to be present. Like as someone who is often has a home, which I am blessed to have filled with little people, sometimes the idea of like a circle in which only God and Yael can enter sounds really nice. Right. And it sounds like you could better daven, you could better think about God, you could actually better connect the bottom world and the top world in that way, because you'd have more time and more focus, right? But what the dimension the conclusion that Rav Hirsch comes to is that when you isolate yourself with and for God, you are not in a hermit-like isolation, right? We don't follow the monk or Coventry model, right? We actually, the Nazir has to isolate of one's mind and spirit in the midst of the most active ordinary life. And here I think you see sort of like a beautiful blending between the Netivot Shalom's path and Rav Hirsch's path, which is to say, Nazirut is about finding a way to set yourself away for God in a way that that inhabits your mind and your intentions for the month. But the trick, what's the Jewish sort of bent on that, is that you have to do it in the midst of all the gashmiut and the tachton of the world and the messiness of people and wine. And, you can't go somewhere where there's no wine. You have to be able to sit at the table and say, you have wine, I'm not having it this month, right? And that is like that's the hard part. That's the challenge that's worth doing, according to Rav Hirsch. And I think that there's something beautiful about that, because even without taking any kinds of vows of Nazirut, right, we can think about how do we balance the beauty of indulging, right, in things that are wonderful, good food, company, parties, right, like that time, while also finding a way to carve out like a part of our mind and our spirit where we want to interact with God sort of exclusively without all that distraction. And that's the challenge of real life. That's the hard part of being a Nazir. And so I think that people chose to be a Nazir for lots of different reasons, like as we talked about. Some for, wanting that challenge, some for needing that time away. And I think right when we zoom out onto Nedarim in general, sometimes neders work out really well in the Torah. They serve as that like anchor, a way to come back to your true intentions. Yaakov, when he has the dream about the angels on the ladder, he makes a vow when he wakes up that he'll return, right? And that was really necessary because he got like a little lost out there in the world with all of the things that he did. And that was a good neder. That anchor brought him back to Israel, brought him back to God. However, we also see in Tanakh places where Nedarim are super dangerous. Yiftach, I would say, is the most famous case of Neder gone wrong. He's out on the battlefield. They're fighting for Israel. And he says, God, if we win this war, I vow that I will sacrifice whatever first crosses my threshold when I return home. And I'm sure, right, that he thought it would be like a cow or a goat or a sheep or maybe even like a servant, as terrible as that sounds. But of course, Yiftach gets home and his daughter runs out to greet him. And it does not go well for his daughter because the text and the community and the priests hold Yiftach to his neder and they sacrifice his daughter. And so we see like the horrible downsides of Nedarim, right? When you don't have to take a neder, but you say, I'm going to be a Nazir for a month, and then you can't go to your own, God forbid, your own mother's funeral, right? That's terrible. You brought that upon yourself, is I think what the Gemara and Tanit is telling us, right? It's not good, the Rambam is saying. We don't add extra things. There's like a rhythm. There's a reason for what God told us we can and can't do. And on the other hand, for Yaakov, it was life-changing. It was altering. And so I think it's part of this journey from being slaves in Egypt where we actually had no autonomy. We couldn't make Nedarim at all, right? You can't take a neder when your time is not your own. To going to Israel, to be a free people with like a whole nation and culture of its own. God is introducing this idea that like, you can do this thing. You can be a Nazir, you can take a neder, you can make a shvuah, but that you have to be very careful because the anchor could weigh you down or it could give you purpose. It could like allow you to use your words with autonomy, or it could allow you to really do a lot of damage with your words, and that we have to sort of do that middling, figuring out when this is appropriate and when it's not, as we become a people and as we move through our journey towards a more fully autonomous lifestyle. So I think a lot of those choices still ring true, even though most people do not take vows of Nazirut anymore.